Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Yonit Arthur and I'm an audiologist and strength coach. I specialize in vestibular disorders. Welcome to my channel, The Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about Mal de Debarquement Syndrome, or MdDS. Mal de Debarquement Syndrome is defined by conventional medicine as a rare neurological disorder or disease that has a specific set of diagnostic criteria. In other words, there are a few different criteria that you have to meet in order to be diagnosed with this disease. But in general, MdDS leads to the sensations of rocking, bobbing, or swaying that persist almost all of the time. So if you have MdDS or MdDS type symptoms, you'll experience the sensation of moving most or all of the time. And it can be extremely distressing. I'm sure you've seen here in the comments people who have been suffering from symptoms like these. And it was time to make sure that I did a full video dedicated very specifically to this set of symptoms. So the official definition of MdDS requires that it occur after passive motion for a period of time. And by passive motion, what I mean is being in a vehicle of some kind and it moving you. So typically, mal de débarquement occurs after disembarking a ship. That's what débarquement means, disembarking. So when people disembark a ship, they encounter these symptoms of rocking, bobbing, or swaying, and that they further persist beyond several months in many cases. Now, for many of these patients, although not all, being exposed to passive motion reduces symptoms. So by that, what I mean is if someone has MdDS type symptoms, being exposed to movement, again, that's passive movement in a car, in a plane, on another boat, will make the symptoms go away temporarily, and then they'll come back once the person is still. I've encountered clients like these who also find that when they walk, when they move around, when they're dancing, they don't feel symptoms, but when they stand still, they do feel symptoms. Now, although the classic definition of MdDS requires this process to occur after being exposed to this kind of passive motion that we just described, there is some scientific literature recognizing a subtype of MdDS in which there is no exposure to passive motion. In other words, some people just develop these feelings of rocking, bobbing, or swaying all the time, and they didn't get off a ship or take a really long car ride or take a really long plane ride. And by the way, just to let you know, those last two, while I have seen some people get triggered by those situations, that is extremely rare. It is much more likely to happen after being on a cruise ship because the minimum dose required to develop this kind of condition is usually at least 48 hours of constant motion. So no one's ever really on a plane or in a car for that long without stopping typically. But that's neither here nor there because what I just mentioned was that some people develop it spontaneously. So we're going to discuss MdDS today, referring to both types. Either MdDS that meets the true definition of MdDS that was brought on by passive motion, or MdDS type symptoms that were brought on spontaneously or not after being exposed to motion like this. So in terms of how it happens, there are a few theories. So one of them is that the VOR, which is the vestibulo-ocular reflex, and that's the reflex that connects your ears to your eyes and allows you to move your head and keep your gaze stable. So notice my eyes will stay on my finger even though my head's moving. I'm able to do that because of the VOR, which is, again, that reflex. So the theory is that that VOR gets out of calibration and it's no longer correctly communicating between the eyes and ears and brain. And when that happens, there can be this sensation of motion. And that's the premise that many of the treatments for MdDS rest on. So one of the most successful treatments is a full-blown version of the home exercise that I have on my 5 minutes of Vestib playlist, which is that optokinetic head roll exercise. So with the full-blown version of that, someone is wearing virtual reality goggles or exposed to those stripes, to moving stripes, in a room in which all of the walls have projectors on them. So they're seeing stripes in their entire field of vision while they're moving their head. Now, the direction of the stripes may change depending on the person's symptoms, and for rocking, the treatment may be a little different from bobbing, but that's the general premise, that by causing the eyes to activate this optokinetic response, which is that, when you're looking at trees moving outside your window in a car, how your eyes kind of jump between the trees. So that's the optokinetic response. The theory is that by activating that optokinetic response in a very specific way, while moving the head in time with that internal sensation of rocking, you can recalibrate that VOR. You can recalibrate the reflex, and then once the reflex is recalibrated, the symptoms will stop, because that's the how of the symptoms. And a second mechanism has been proposed that says that we have an internal representation of motion. So I've talked about how this might work in a different video about visual vertigo. So in that video, I go into much more depth than I'm going to on this one about how the brain is a prediction machine and how its predictions are going to directly affect what you perceive from your senses. But in short, basically the idea here is that the brain uses templates to predict what's going to happen. And if the template is wrong, so let's just say your brain assumes you're going to be moving, but you're not actually moving, it's going to completely mess up how it's perceiving information from your senses, and therefore how you're going to experience life. So in the case of mal de débarquement, you could see how this might happen. If you're on a cruise ship for a few days, you go out to your cruise, you're rocking the whole time, your brain calibrates to that rocking, it gets used to the idea that you're moving all the time. And then when you come off, all of its predictions are wrong. And so it's expecting movement even though there isn't any, and that causes this internal feeling of movement even though your senses are telling your brain that you're not actually moving anymore. So I like to think about mal de débarquement type symptoms as involving both of these mechanisms. So again, we have our internal representation of movement. So our brain is predicting a certain movement or not movement. That affects how the senses are working. So that could affect potentially, for example, the VOR, or the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And then from there, if it's wrong, that's going to produce this sensation of motion, or these symptoms, this misprediction, or this misunderstanding of still environments being moving. And by the way, what does this look like to you now that I'm showing you this cycle here? Looks a lot like a neural circuit, doesn't it? So if you're familiar with my channel, you already know where I'm going with this, but if you are not familiar with my channel, hang on, I'm getting to it. So interestingly enough, what I just described actually goes wrong in a large majority of people getting off of cruise ships. That's called land sickness. And up to 80% of people who get off of a ship, who've been on a ship for a little while, will have this experience of movement, or the ground moving beneath them, even though their bodies aren't actually moving anymore. So this particular little arc, or this particular little circuit, is actually completely normal. Where it goes wrong in MdDS is that it keeps going after the brain is getting information from the senses that you're not actually moving. So most people who get off a cruise ship and have this sensation, which again is completely normal, have that sensation go away relatively quickly, because as soon as the brain gets information from the sense of touch, from the eyes, from the ears, that things aren't actually moving anymore, it corrects the prediction. So it recalibrates the system, and we go back to realizing that we're still and everything is hunky-dory. So the real problem with MdDS, again, is that this keeps going. So in my opinion, one of the things that's going wrong with our current thinking about MdDS is that there's a huge emphasis on understanding how this happens and understanding the mechanisms, but there's almost no emphasis on the why. There's this black box that is keeping this cycle going? And science has no answer and doesn't really seem to have as big of an interest in understanding that black box that keeps the cycle going, and is focusing on correcting the how. So instead of looking at the why, many times science is looking at the how. And the reason for that is because when you have a complex biopsychosocial condition like MdDS, and again, if you are not familiar with my channel, when I say biopsychosocial, I mean that all conditions that involve the central nervous system, which is pretty much every condition, has biological components, psychological components, so parts of the psyche or the mind, and social components relating to how well someone's being supported, the social environment he or she is in, past experiences, etc. When it comes to these complex biopsychosocial conditions, science has a very heavy biological bias. So the current trend in scientific research is toward randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials are, of course, the gold standard for determining if a particular treatment works. But the thing is that you can't really closely control in a study something that has very heavy psychosocial elements. So let me bring this all together if this isn't clear. If you were to investigate something like a pill or a transmagnetic stimulation, which is again something actually that has been shown to help with MdDS temporarily, that's easy to control. You're going to treat all the subjects the same. You're going to give them the same treatment or a placebo, so they're going to get non-treatment or treatment, and it's very easy to compare between the groups. It is not so easy when you're looking at the psychosocial components of these conditions, because people come from many different backgrounds, people have completely different responses to their condition. They may have support, they may not have support, they have different levels of stress, they have different personalities, they have different ages, they have different life conditions. I mean, there are just so many potential factors. It's almost impossible to control for them in a study like that. And that's why there are other types of studies that can look at these conditions, but they don't meet that same standard or that same, again, in vogue standard right now of being able to be operationalized as a random control trial. So they can't be made into a randomized control trial, or they can't be made as easily. I'm not a researcher, so there may be, hopefully, researchers watching this video who will say, I know how to operationalize this and make this into a study. If you do, please email me. I would love to take part in that. But we know MdDS is a complex biopsychosocial condition, and we know this for a few reasons. We know that it has a strong relationship with migraines, which themselves are known to be a biopsychosocial condition. We know that many people who get off cruise ships have this particular response, these particular symptoms, but they don't develop the condition and other people do. We know that there's a high recurrence rate among people who've had it, and it's about 25%. But that tells us that even if you're prone to it, you don't always get it. And once you've had it, you might be more likely to get it. That means that it's not purely biological. For example, when I say something purely biological, I'm going to oversimplify this concept and say, for example, a tumor. A tumor would just cause the problem. It wouldn't sometimes cause the problem and then other times not cause the problem. If it's purely biological, if there's a massive tumor in there, it's just going to always cause a problem. When it doesn't, there has to be some complexity to the factors that are leading to the symptoms to come back. And again, what science doesn't know right now is how much is biological and how much is psychosocial. My clinical experience, not randomized control trials, because there just haven't been any on these particular factors, but based on my experience, the psychosocial factors of MdDS are enormous. In fact, I would argue, and this is my opinion, that the psychosocial factors are even greater than the biological factors. And this is an idea that's been dismissed in research on MdDS. And a side note here, there really hasn't been very much research on MdDS. And with the exception of a few studies that have looked at things like pre-existing anxiety, there's been almost no emphasis at all on the psychosocial factors affecting MdDS. And again, we've already talked about why that might be. It's just much messier to study. So to date, There hasn't even been a single study on cognitive behavioral therapy for MdDS, whereas for a related counterpart, PPPD or triple PD, which produces totally different symptoms, which has a different mechanism, but is also a chronic or recurring vestibular condition for some people, there has been strong evidence that CBT is one of the most powerful tools we have to treat it. So there's a huge void in the evidence right now in terms of how we treat MdDS, especially for people who fail the conventional treatments, who've already done the stripes and have already gone to the lab and had the VR goggles, or who've been treated with migraine medications in some cases. For people who fail those treatments or still have recurrences, conventional medicine basically has no answers for them. And I think, again, that this is because conventional medicine has not at all thoroughly investigated the psychosocial components of the development of MdDS. So coming back to that cycle that we talked about earlier, I believe that the black box that is keeping that cycle going is stress. And when I say stress, it's very easy to start thinking about just kind of the daily stresses of life, like being stuck in traffic, or I have a mean boss, or I've been fighting with my spouse, and those are all stressors as well. But those surface level things are not the only source of stress. And again, based on my clinical experience and the clinical experience of many others who work within the field that I work in, which is the field of psychophysiological disorders, or disorders that are driven by psychological or stress-related factors and produce true physiological changes, so functional changes in the body. Our clinical experience suggests that it's actually the deeper levels of stress that lead to these kinds of conditions and illnesses. And by that, what I mean is internal stress, and very frequently that refers to repressed emotions. I'm not saying that being sad causes people to have MdDS, but I'm saying there's a powerful mechanism that has been shown for other chronic conditions similar to MdDS that have no clear physical abnormality associated with them, that produce this strange persistence and chronicity or recurrences of symptoms in people for no clear reason, that emotional repression and internal stress play a huge role in how these symptoms end up keeping going. In other words, that is the black box for many chronic conditions like MdDS. And I don't see a good reason why that thinking is not being applied to MdDS. Now, I would love, again, as I mentioned already, to see a study on this, but it's very hard to operationalize because unlike a pill that everyone gets that's exactly the same, this would require people to have therapy. This would require people to work with emotions and deal with internal stress. And you could see how just a wide range of factors could affect this, ranging from the rapport between a therapist and the patient. It could be affected by the patient themselves, whether they believe that this is a problem or not. I mean, I'm just not even going to go into this, but it's very clear that it's much, much harder to control a study like this. It would be very, very difficult. But it has been done, and it's been done for conditions like chronic pain. And it is my dearest wish that MdDS will soon be given the airtime it deserves, like chronic pain is being given right now. We have incredible tools, such as functional MRI imaging, to really truly study the effects of these psychosocial interventions on someone's MdDS symptoms. It's been done before, and again, my hope is that it will soon be done on MdDS. But in the meantime, if you're here on this channel, you've failed conventional treatments, or you're concerned that you have MdDS and you're not sure, I want to share with you that based on my clinical experience and the clinical experience of those that I work with, MdDS is a psychophysiological condition. And by that, what I mean is it's a condition that is very, very heavily influenced by deep psychological factors. By the way, psychological factors affect our well-being all the time. There's nothing extraordinary about having psychophysiological disorders. We all have some level of psychophysiological disorder at some point in our lives. But with MdDS, it produces these extremely distressing symptoms for so many people. So it's time to have a conversation about the why rather than just the how. And in my opinion, the why as for many other psychophysiological disorders, is emotional pain and repressed emotions and difficult life experiences that have not been resolved. The how is the mechanisms we discussed at the beginning of this video. But we shouldn't be treating the how, we should be treating the why. So if you've watched this whole video, then you're probably wondering what you can do about your MdDS. Well, that's what this entire channel is dedicated to. The VRT, or vestibular rehabilitation therapy exercises that I have on this channel and that I've proposed are not going to apply to you if you have MdDS, because you won't have motion-triggered symptoms in most cases, although you're welcome to do them if they trigger symptoms. For you, the treatment needs to focus on the why, not the how. And sometimes, in fact, for at least 30% of people, just understanding that past emotional experience can lead to the brain creating these mispredictions. And by that, again, I want to be very clear, you're not making up your symptoms. It's not psychosomatic, like, oh, I'm making up this rocking symptom. That's not it at all. The rocking symptom is completely real. Your VOR is malfunctioning. When I say psychophysiological, what I mean is that the brain's chemistry is being affected by these psychological factors, these past emotions, these difficult situations you've been involved in, this trauma. And when you are just aware that that can happen, that is enough for 30 to 40% of people that I see to just get better right away. When that's not enough, then you want to dig in a little further and apply some of the stress reduction techniques I talk about on this channel. I have an entire course where I will teach you all the methods that I use with my patients, and it's completely free, no weirdness. You can sign up at the link below, I'll link to it. But understand that although MdDS appears to be very different on its face than some of the other conditions that I talk about on this channel, because the symptoms are so different, my belief, an educated belief based on my clinical experience and those of my colleagues, is that the mechanism may be different, but the cause, the why, is the same. And if you address the why, if you address the cause, you're going to get better. And that doesn't require you to have repeated treatments at a lab. It doesn't require you to suffer for many years with this problem. It requires you to sit down and understand what's going on inside that might be fueling this condition. And again, there's a lot of precedent for this. This is not specific to MdDS, but I know my audience has probably not heard this about their condition anywhere else. So I thought it was very important to talk about it today. So I look forward to hearing your comments below. And if you found this video helpful or informative, please share, like, and subscribe. I will talk to you guys soon.